Hey everyone, back home today for our Apologetic Wednesdays, and as I promised last week, I would be responding to these three things that I said that are what I consider to be the strongest arguments against the existence of God, right? And why I have arguments against them, and I'm going to give them to you today. So let's just work our way down the list. So the first one that comes up a lot of the time is that you can't scientifically prove God, right? So ever since the Enlightenment, science has kind of become the way that we have tried to measure the world in every aspect, right? I mean, this is why everything has become so data-driven, and even things that cannot really be science have gotten labeled as science, like economics or political science or things like that, right? It becomes about having some sort of method, right? And it's good. Science is a great thing, so not to attack science or whatever. But it has become this be-all, end-all. One of my friends has referred to physicists being the new priest class of the modern age, because like you can slap a physicist on almost anything and people will just start believing what they say, right? Even if they are totally full of it or making stuff up, which happens quite a bit. But regardless, I think it's an apt description of what's kind of happening. So before we get into all of these, especially this first one, I'm going to use a big word, and I want you to know this word. And this word is presuppositional. Presuppositional. So let's break down this word a little bit. Presume, right? So if you presume something, you are making a belief or an idea about something that you already have a bunch of underlying beliefs for that you aren't really taking into account, right? So if someone's car is broken down on the side of the road, you would just say, oh, it's probably a flat tire, right? You can think that. You don't really know all of the little pieces that led into their car being on the side of the road, but you can make an educated guess and say, well, it's probably a flat tire or whatever. And that's a presupposition. So one of the things that has become very useful in thinking about all arguments, but specifically theological ones, especially when dealing with atheists in the West, is to talk about presuppositions. So presuppositions are things that people will assume are good, usually, or assume are true without actually looking at the philosophical things behind them, right? So when we say we have no scientific proof for God, well, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that we have to have scientific proof for everything? Well, that can't really happen. We can't have much scientific proof in terms of psychology or sociology or all these other things, because all those things involve human beings, and you can't really study human beings in the way that you can other things. You can do some parts of it, the biological processes, and that's about it. Once you hit the brain, you really can't do much. You can try, but they're continually stymied because the brain is just too complex. You can presume that science is a good thing, right? You can presume that the way that science is done is the correct way, even though many people for many centuries kind of got by just fine doing their own thing. So, for instance, we see this in the Bible all the time, right? People, especially like Babylonians and stuff, using stars to guide their way. And that's what they thought was the most efficient, best way of doing things, right? And I think for our modern age, science has kind of filled that gap. Again, love science. I think it's great. But when we presume that the universe has certain laws in motion, certain rules, we have to understand, like, where do you get those ideas from? Do these rules just kind of float around in some abstract point of way, or are they from something else, right? And this is why the whole unmoved mover thing is such a powerful argument for many scientists when it comes to God, because at the base level, you can't really know what's beyond the quark, beyond conjecture. And as soon as you've gotten onto conjecture, science has kind of ended where it can go, right? It can only deal in things that are actually material and physical, not things that are beyond that. So it's hard to deal with that type of thing. And you can measure these types of things in many different ways, but you once there's a point that's hit, you can't really go too far. There's a famous philosopher and biologist called Stephen Jay Gould, and he's dead now, but in the late 90s and early 2000s, he was a big proponent of the NOMA theory, which is non-overlapping magisteria. And he basically said that science has its own rules, and it's over here, and theology and philosophy have their own rules, and it's over here. And they have kind of their things that they deal with on one side. So, for instance, science cannot tell you how to be good, right? It can't do that. It can't deal with philosophical questions. It can't even, like, even if you want to say, like, this many statistics leads to this outcome, you have to show me why that outcome is good. If you can't, then it's useless. Theology and philosophy cannot really tell you how this isn't true, but I always love saying it, how the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, right? We can't deal with that over here. That's for science to deal with, okay? And these two things have their own series, and you have to be able to hold them up in their respective areas and not let one take over the other, right? All right, so that's kind of my first answer to point one. Second one is that gods, whatever, are made up in order to explain the natural universe. And this ties in with question one. Now that we know how the natural universe exists, we don't need, or works, we don't need gods. And I actually think this is true for a lot of different faiths, right? Definitely a lot of pagan religions use deities in order to explain things, right? So why does it thunder? It's because Thor is using his hammer to kill frost giants, right? And that's just something people believed. And when they were Christianized, that went away, and I mean, the Christians never really had an explanation for thunder, which is what I'll kind of get into. And now it's like, we know how, we can guess kind of and get pretty close to how thunder happens, right? Well, this is kind of where the Bible is unique, because outside of some very, very specific instances, the Bible never really tells you how anything is made, right? So you have Genesis, but even then it doesn't go into the exact definition and why all these things happen. And beyond that, the Bible kind of leaves it up for man to discover these things. It's much more focused on other matters. People will point to stories like the Noah's Ark, right? And they have the rainbow, and it's like, oh, that's how the rainbow was made. It's like, well, no, that's not actually what it says. It's just that that's what God uses to mark the covenant in that instance. Rainbows could have existed before that or not. But the point of Noah's Ark is not to show how the rainbow was made, right? The point of Noah's Ark is to describe God's relationship with humanity, especially in light of the flood, right? These are not, if you look at this in light of other ancient religions, it's not the same thing. They'll have whole stories that are just dedicated to how the tiger got his spots or whatever, right? And that's the whole point of of that God, is kind of that type of thing. And that's not true of all religions. So it's hard to judge these things to being the same, and I think it's kind of playing on people's ignorance of the texts in order to convince them of these things. Speaking of it, we're at our last part, right? Speaking of different religions, diversity of religious experience, how can you know which religion is right? Well, you first have to, if we can get to this idea that some sort of supernatural theological force exists in the world, then we can get to the discussion about how we can find out which religion is right. And that comes down to historical evidence, theological arguments, all this stuff that can happen after the fact, and debating, which makes more sense. And that's actually the best place that science can come in, is at that tail end of things. Because if you have a religion that sets everything up for being like, oh, this is why grass is green, because this fertility god makes it green or whatever, then you can actually have someone who comes in and say, no, that's not why, or whatever, and then you can have these debates. But you can't really get to point 3 until you actually really acknowledge that there's any deity in the world, because before that you can't really make any case as to why or why not some religions are better than others, because they really are. If you don't believe in any deity, then they're all made up and equally worthless, in my estimation. So I hope that these have given you some arguments or some things to think about. This is not, again, I would try to keep these videos short, not exactly how I would talk about these things in a long form talk, but that kind of gets my basic feelings out there. So feel free to contact me with any questions or information. I hope to see you guys tomorrow for Culture Thursdays. So I will see you then.